So let me, from the beginning, there we go. Okay, so y'all should be able to see my slide set now. Let me go backwards. Anyway, I've been doing Master Gardener training now since 1998, and this is one of those classes that I actually really enjoy doing. Most people think of botany, you see a lot of people calling this basic botany, but what I've learned through the years is I want to call it practical botany, because there's a lot of difference between a botanist and a horticulturist. And a botanist is very scientific in the way they're looking at things, looking at plant structures, looking at plant processes from that biological viewpoint. But those of us that are gardeners look at things from a horticultural standpoint, which is how do we make things grow and make them work well, grow well. So with that, it's going to be a little bit more challenging if you look at a botany book, they're going to talk about things in one way. But if you're looking at gardening books, they sometimes use slightly different terms or use them in a slightly different way. And that's kind of what we're going to be looking at, is the difference between those, because as you're going through other classes, you are going to see some of these terms. And so today I'm going to give you a semester's worth of botany, or half of a semester of botany in 2 hours, and then we'll finish it up later in the week. So with this, there's going to be a lot of information thrown at you. Don't worry about it. Just, I want you to think about it in the big picture, and then take the information or whatever notes you're doing, go back and review then what is in your Master Gardener books, because all of this stuff comes from the Master Gardener book. And I know they've updated it since I did this, but the same basic information is in there. If anything, I may need to add some things, and I really don't have time to do that. So if it goes fast, don't worry about it. I am not afraid of questions. And so if you have a question, you're going to have to speak up, because we don't have the chat going. And I may be able to answer it right at that minute, or I may say, hold on a minute, we're getting to that. And I will be asking for people to answer a few questions too along the way. I'll tell you, for me, it's harder to do this virtually than it is in a classroom. This is really set up for a classroom style presentation. So with that, let's go on and talk about botany. And when we get into practical botany, one of the first things we start talking about is classification and classification systems. And what we base our classification, our naming system, we call this nomenclature. That's one of those big words that's out there, and it basically means naming. And we use a binomial nomenclature system, which binomial essentially just means two names. Big word for a two-name system. And with that, we use a genus and a species. Sometimes we call that the scientific name. Sometimes we call that the botanical name. But it's all part of this binomial nomenclature system that uses a genus and a species to identify both plants and animals. And this was developed by Carl Linnaeus back in the 1700s. That's his portrait on the side over there. But so we've used this system for a while, because we have to have some kind of uniformity. And that's the key to make sure that it's there. So in plants, the classification was developed around plant parts. And now as we're getting into using more of the DNA background, there's been some reclassifications based on the genetic similarities. But still, ultimately, it goes back to basic plant parts is what they use for the classification system. So here there's a couple of things that we talk about. Sometimes we talk about common names and we talk about scientific names. And this is where I need some people to speak up in just a second. So which one do y'all usually use the most? Common names or scientific?
Common name.
Common name. Okay. Why do you like to use common names?
Because everybody uses that.
Everybody uses them. For the most part, that's what you see. And why wouldn't you use scientific names?
Most people don't take botany.
Harder to pronounce.
They're hard to pronounce. Some people don't take botany. So it confuses them some. They're hard to remember. They're hard to the spellings are difficult. So there's a lot of reasons behind it. Now, which one should we use and why?
Because it's easier to designate and separate them.
I didn't get the first part of yours, Linda.
It's the actual name too. That way you don't confuse the plants or put
What is the actual name? I'm sorry, what is the actual name?
Well, you have a family. Are they in the same family, or are you going to go down to genus and species?
Are you talking about common name or scientific name? That's the basic I'm starting with. Which one are you saying? We should be using scientific name. Thank you. That's again, without having you in person, I only get, sometimes it pauses and I miss the first word of what you're saying.
Totally understand.
So scientific name is what you're saying we should use. And the reason behind that, again, I was asking which is better, common or scientific. The scientific name, and that reason why is there's only one scientific name per plant. And you know what you're talking about because there are lots of common names for plants out there for the same plant. And common names are usually found in different regions, something that people can relate to. It's easy for people to know that. So when we're looking at for instance, this plant that's on the side over here, it's got a big green base to it. This is a small example, but it's got these 5-leaflet compound leaf to it. It is a tropical plant out of Mexico. And if you see a larger one, it's sometimes called the shaving brush tree. It's a Pseudobombax ellipticum. And again, here they even changed this a few years ago. It used to just be Bombax ellipticum, and then someone decided it's not a real Bombax, so we're going to call it a Pseudobombax. So they've made a few minor changes in it. But sometimes it's called the shaving brush tree. Sometimes it's the Mexican shaving brush tree. If you're in Mexico, why call it Mexican shaving brush? If you're not in Mexico, a lot of people go, where did it come from? Well, it came from Mexico. So guess what they did? They added Mexican to the beginning of the common name to it. So it became the Mexican shaving brush tree. Some people will call it, and again, at the top, when it blooms, before it puts out leaves in the spring, you get these flowers that open up and it looks like that old-fashioned men's shaving brush. That's where it got its name. A common name is usually based on an observation, something you can relate to and easily remember. So you have this plant that has this flower at the top that looks like a shaving brush. So that's one of the names for it. So again, the scientific name is Pseudobombax ellipticum. Some people just call it a bombax tree, depending on where you're from and how long ago it was. Mexican shaving brush, again, another common name, but there are a few select people, and I'm going to, or it's just a shaving brush tree. But y'all are going to be initiated into this very small group of people that will also know it as another common name. And that common name is the frogbutt plant. And the reason why, this is exactly how common names start. When I first got married, I had a Pseudobombax ellipticum in a pot. And when it originally was brought over from Mexico, they had to cut the top off. And it came over bare root, and then it was rooted. And 2 branches came out, and they both were very large. You can see kind of in the picture down below that, I'm sorry, go back. In this picture, you see how that large trunk is? You see those big branches coming out? Well, I had one that had 2 very distinct branches coming out from the big base. And when I got married, my wife says, that plant looks like a frog that's digging into the pot and its butt is sticking out. So she just started calling it the frog butt plant because I had 150 plants or whatever. And she's like, couldn't remember the names of plants. And if something happened and that plant fell down, she didn't know what to call it. So she started calling it the frog butt plant. But when she called it the frog butt plant, I knew what it was. And so that's how a common name actually occurs. People say, it looks like this. This is what it reminds me of. And that's where we come up with common names. But I'll tell you, you go anywhere outside of Nueces and Aransas, San Patricio counties, the chances are people aren't going to know what a frog butt plant is, because that's something that came up here that I have taught people based on what my wife put down. So there may only be a very small people that call a plant a certain thing. Or there may be something else that someone else somewhere else believes looks like a frog's butt, but that's how a common name comes up. But it doesn't mean that very many people will know what it is. But if you go back to Pseudobombax ellipticum and you go anywhere else in the world, they can find out what you're talking about, because that is the scientific name. And there's only one plant that's associated with that name. So let's go back to a couple of plants that have names. The plant that's on the side over here, common Texas native plant with the purple flowers. Does anyone, what's a common name for that? Anyone have any common names for
Mexican
that?
sage.
Okay, Mexican sage. Someone else. What's another name?
Cenizo.
Cenizo. Okay, what's another name?
Texas sage.
Just Texas sage. Okay, anything else you can think of?
Texas sage.
Texas sage. Okay, some of the ones that have been out there, I'll show you. Texas sage is the most common. Some people will just call it purple sage because it's got purple flowers. They don't always remember that. Again, these are common names. Some people call it Texas silverleaf. That when you look at the leaf out in the wild, the original color is very silver to it. So some people will just call it Texas silverleaf. I've heard it called the barometer plant because it blooms around the time that we get rain. And that is a natural occurrence. It's an adaptation so that it can survive and make flowers. They get pollinated and then make seeds in wet periods after very long drought periods. So barometer plant is another name for it. I've heard it called Texas Ranger. I've heard it called Cenizo. But if you want to make sure you're getting the right plant, it's Leucophyllum frutescens. So that is the scientific name, the genus in the front, the species in the back. The genus is always listed first and it's capitalized. And the species, I forgot to say this earlier, always starts with a small lowercase letter. So that's how you can tell the difference between a genus and a species when you see them together. And the other thing is they either need to be italicized or underlined so people know that that is the scientific name. So that's an example of common names. And some people have never heard of Texas silverleaf, but if you go in, and so there's a lot of plants in Texas that have silver leaves on them. Would y'all agree with that? So if you just start talking about a Texas silverleaf, there could be a lot of visions in people's heads. But if you go back and talk about the Leucophyllum frutescens, then you'll know what it is. Another confusion when you get into common, here's another example of common versus scientific name. This is Charicia speciosa. This is a tropical tree we have around here with big thorns on it. Do y'all know any of the common names for this tree? Sure, someone has one in their yard or used to have one before the freeze. Does anyone have a kapok tree or a silk floss tree?
Ours died.
So yeah, it died. That's how most people's have done. Ours actually came back from the base. So I'm excited that it finally started back about a month ago. We just left it alone down here at the Botanical Gardens, and it's finally coming back, and it's growing very rapidly. But a silk floss tree or a kapok tree. Now, you look at silk floss, I could have thought that flower at the top of the Mexican shaving brush was had silky floss to it, but it's not. And this is actually talking about the floss inside the fruit. If you take a fruit and open it up, it has a silky floss interior component to it. Another example of common names versus scientific name. The scientific name of this is Gaillardia grandiflora. What are some names that y'all have heard this one called, this wildflower?
That's a summer daisy.
I'm sorry, Linda, you're echoing a little bit, so I couldn't understand what you just said.
Summer daisy.
Summer daisy. Okay, that's one I haven't heard of. That's a good one. I'll add that to my list. What else?
Blanket flower.
Blanket flower.
Firewheel.
Firewheel. Anything else? Okay, some of the others, firewheel, Indian blanket. Sometimes it's just called Gaillardia, but I will also add the quote, just blanket flower without the Indian component on it. So those are all common names. But if you want to make sure you're getting something, you say firewheel, some people may not know what it is. Or you talk about Indian blanket or blanket flower, they may be picturing something else. So again, using that scientific name of Gaillardia grandiflora is a good thing to make sure you're talking about the right plant. And it just takes time to learn these and use them. The more you use them, the more you become familiar with them, then the easier it gets. So, and the less you use them, you kind of forget them. I'll tell you, I don't remember all the scientific names. I'm not afraid to say that because I don't use them all the time, but I will go back and especially if I'm going somewhere else, I will double check and get caught back up and start using those again, because I want to make sure people are looking at the right plant when we're talking about it. Here's another one. That common name of sage has a lot of, we looked at this plant before. This is the Texas sage, which is the Leucophyllum frutescens, and it is in the family of Scrophulariaceae. And try to say that 3 times fast. But that is the family it's in, which is one notch above the genus, but it's in that family. But there's other plants that have the common name of sage. For instance, Mexican bush sage. We have Mexican bush sage in their yard. That's this plant here. That's Salvia leucantha. And it's
Sage.
Okay. And so it is in the family of Lamiaceae. It's in a completely different family, even though it's got the common name sage, just like that Texas sage. So if you hear a common name of sage, it could be plants that are very different in very different families. Or the common garden sage also is another one that is in the same family. But that common garden sage that we use for cooking all the time, it is in that same family as the Mexican bush sage. They're both salvias. You can see they're in the same genus, even just different species, and in the same family. But they're not related, closely related to what we commonly call Texas sage. So common names can cause more confusion. And like I said, this example is using the common name of sage. So with that, are there any questions about common versus scientific name? Everyone good on that? And why we need to strive to learn those scientific names, particularly if we're talking about things. And you can use it once. Like a lot of times when I do a presentation, I'll say Texas sage, Leucophyllum frutescens, and then I'll go in and put that in, or even when I'm writing an article, I'll use a common name, but I'll put the scientific name almost all the time. I try to put that scientific name afterwards so that whoever's reading it, if they go on the internet and they see something and they're from Maine, they'll know what plant that is, because their thoughts of a sage may be different than my thoughts. So that's why we use the scientific name. Now, classification systems. This is the general order of classifications, going from the largest down to the smallest, or almost the smallest. You may see these listed below species. Sometimes you'll see some people talking about cultivars, which a cultivar is a cultivated species. So it's just a variation of that species, essentially. Or you may hear someone talk about the subspecies. And that, again, it's a variation of that species. But when you look at the classification system, the largest is the kingdom for plants, and then it goes to the phylum, the class, and then below that, order, family, genus, and species. Well, you have the same thing. Plants and animals start in that same thing, other than they start in the kingdom. Now, the phylum is different. They don't use the word phylum in animals, they use the word division. But after that, it goes into classes, orders, families, genus, and species. So you're going to see the same going from a very broad grouping all the way down to these very specific plants, the same genus and species, both for animals and plants. And the reason I'm saying this is when you start hearing about insects, for instance, they'll start talking about different classes or different orders of insects. And I'll tell you, I always used to forget which is broader, which encompasses more, classes or orders. Well, a class is bigger. It's got more stuff in it than the order does, because the order is a subsection of a class. So in my mind, it's like, I have to remember how this goes. And so when I was in college, one of the memory helpers that I was given, which maybe this will help you, was kind professors cannot often fail good students. So kind professors cannot often fail good students. But that helped me remember that a class is above an order. An order is above the family. So it's just that first letter off of kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. For me, when I was in college, that was how I could remember it. Some people, they don't, that didn't help them. So the foodies, when I first started teaching Master Gardeners, gave me a different one I'd never heard of before, but I'm going to give that one to you too. They used King Philip came over for good spaghetti. So if you like food, maybe that one's easier for you. But for me, I like the kind professors cannot often fail good students. But again, back to the higher it is, the closer it is to kingdom, the broader, the more stuff that's in it. And as you get closer to a family and then a genus, that's much more specific. It's smaller groupings. So you're going to have, when you look at this from the bottom to the top, you're going to have a bunch of different species within a genus. And then you're going to have different, the singular is genus, the plural is genera. So you may see the word genera, which just means multiple, more than one genus. So you're going to have different genera within a family. So that family of Lamiaceae or the mint family, you're going to have different genera in there, because that's where coleus fall, that's where salvias fall, that's where most of our herbs are in that family. And then there's going to be multiple families within an order. There's going to be multiple orders within a class. There's multiple classes within a phylum. Does that make sense to y'all? So back to you get groupings and you put them together into a genus, and you have those, you know, that's the difference from top to bottom. So I just want to make sure y'all understand that. So that's not the only classification system, but that's how Linnaeus put his together, that binomial nomenclature that uses the genus and species at the bottom. But it does have more to it. It does have the family, the class, the order, all of that above it. So some of those other classifications that you may hear about, I just want to make sure that y'all see. Sometimes we talk about, excuse me, angiosperms and gymnosperms. Those are terms that you hear a lot in botany, and that is within this. The angiosperms are a subkingdom, or which is kind of just below that division phylum. Just below the kingdom. That's what we call it, is the angiospermae. But under there, it's the phylum of Anthophyta, and then you have classes below that, because remember, kind professors cannot class. The classes of angiosperms are flowering plants. The common name for angiosperms are all true flowering plants. We talk about monocots and dicots. Monocots, and you'll hear a lot of this, is that actually refers to the class of Liliopsida. Liliopsida are those kind of grass-like leaves. You'll talk about those again, and we'll talk in more detail. Or you have the dicots, which have the two seed leaves, which are in the class of Magnoliopsida. So again, you're seeing that these are divisions. The classes are are subunits of that phylum. Okay, and besides the angiosperms in that subkingdom, we have another subkingdom of gymnosperms, and these are the plants that have naked seeds or cone-bearing plants. So they're not considered true flowering plants, but that includes all of our conifers, our cycads, ginkgos, and the nettes. So anyway, but they are known as having, quote, naked seeds and not being, quote, true flowering plants. So again, slightly different thing in the where that division came from. And that's because up above, you have very ancient plants, which are your gymnosperms, and angiosperms are considered to be a much more modern plant that developed, the true flowering plants developed later when you're looking at changes in plants over time. So let's look within there. Let's go back. The main one we typically talk about are monocots versus dicots. So I do want to spend a little time on that classification of what's a monocot versus a dicot, because we're going to call it that. We're not going to call them Liliopsida and Magnoliopsida. That's, we're going to go back to what you're going to hear, which is monocots versus dicot. Mono means what? One. I saw Sandra's finger go up and I heard Tom say it. Okay, di means what?
Two.
Two. So you're looking at one versus two, monocots versus dicots. So a monocot has it's really an abbreviation for monocotyledonous. That means it had the cotyledon are the seed leaves. That the first thing that emerges when a seed, a true seed plant, seed-bearing plant comes up, you have this, quote, seed leaf. And so a monocot only has one of those when it emerges from the soil. And a dicot would have how many? Two. There you go. So we're going to go first through monocots, and then I'm going to compare the dicots to them. So you'll know the answer to dicot is short for dicotyledonous. So, but no one wants to say dicotyledonous constantly, so we've abbreviated it to dicot. Monocots have what we call sheath leaf attachment, and I'll show you a few pictures of this. But essentially where that leaf attaches at the stem of the plant, it kind of wraps around that stem. Think about a corn plant. That's the classic example. You see how that corn leaf kind of wraps all the way around. It forms a sheath, and that stem continues to grow past that sheath point. So that's got what we call sheath leaf attachment. It also has parallel venation. So when you look at a plant leaf, the veins are going up and down straight along the length of that leaf. And then the other thing is within the leaf, if you take a cross section of the leaf or a cross section of the stem, particularly of the stem is where you're going to see it, you're going to see what we call bundle sheaths, which is the vascular system that moves the water and nutrients up through the plant and moves carbohydrates down and around through the plant. So those in a monocot, they are in small little bundles, kind of like pieces of rope that are intertwined, but you'll find those all throughout the stem of the plant. They also are known for having fibrous roots. That's smaller roots that are all about the same size. And their flower parts are in threes, multiples of threes. So those are some ways to help identify at a glance whether you think something is a monocot or a dicot. And part of the reason that this is going to be later on when we're talking about herbicides, we have some chemicals that work on monocots that don't work on dicots. We have some chemicals that work on dicots, but not on monocots. And then we have some that kill everything. So you're going to see that come up again. So these will, again, you're going to keep seeing this. So again, monocots, one seed leaf when it emerges, but how often do we see the plant when it first comes out of the soil? So we have to have other things. So we look for that sheath leaf attachment, the parallel veins going up and down the leaf, the vascular bundle if you happen to cut across a stem, the fibrous roots if you dig it up, or if it happens to be flowering, you can count the flower parts. Like how many petals, is it a multiple of 3 or not? So dicots, what make them a little bit different is first, and examples of monocots are grasses, as well as some other things, corn, St. Augustine grass, palm trees. You look at how a palm leaf is attached, it wraps around the stem. It is a closer relative. Even though we call it a palm tree, it's not a tree. Most trees are dicots. And so is more closely related to grass, to St. Augustine grass and palm. So when you see that palm tree, think of it as a giant grass plant. That kind of might blow your mind a little bit, but that's really, it's more closely related to grass. And so when you have things that affect grass, it's more likely to affect your palms because they're more closely related. Okay. So dicots, we already talked about this. They have 2 true seed leaves. So when it comes up out of the ground, the bean plant is the classic one. It comes up, you have these 2 little things that open up. That's the cotyledons, and they are seed leaves. They're not true leaves, but they are they provide protection when it comes out of the ground, and it also provides nutrients for those roots to get started. But instead of sheath leaf attachment, we have what we call direct leaf attachment. So if you take a leaf off of, let's say, a hibiscus plant, and you look, you have a little round leaf scar on the stem because that leaf was directly attached. It didn't wrap all the way around. If you look at that corn plant and you take a leaf off, it kind of has a little ring all the way around. So that's the difference. A direct leaf attachment leaves kind of a little round dish, or kind of almost a smiley face or U-shaped scar, where it is directly attached into that stem. You also have, instead of parallel venation, remember we said that goes up and down the leaf like a corn plant does, netted veins, or a netted venation, is classic for dicots. And so you're going to see this intertwining up with, if you take a leaf and you turn it upside down, you're going to see those veins. You're going to have some distinct large veins, but you're going to have small ones that intertwine and kind of cross over. So that's what we mean by netted venation. You'll see examples in a few minutes. The vascular system in a dicot are in rings. Oh, and I misspelled the word growth. So I'll try to. Anyway, so you have a vascular system that have rings, like the rings of a tree. So if you're seeing a stem that's been cut off and you see that ring formation, more than likely it's a dicot. If it is if it's an angiosperm, a true flowering plant. The root system, when we talk about a taproot system versus a fibrous root system, the difference is, I mean, it doesn't mean it has one single main root coming down. There's lots of different types of taproots. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But it means that you have roots that some of them are larger, and then you have smaller roots and smaller roots as they go out. When you're looking at, and so they get continually smaller as you get further away from the main plant, the main trunk. But in a monocot, the roots are relatively the same size. You don't get a palm tree that has 10-inch roots going down. You have a lot of these little tiny roots that are spread out, but there's so many of them, it gives it a lot of stability. Where a taproot system, even if it's a multiple taproot system that divides out, like we see in many of our shrubs, like again, hibiscus being an example, or an oak tree. That oak tree has several large roots, and then they get smaller. It splits off into smaller roots. Those split off into smaller roots. Those split off into smaller roots. That's what we mean by a taproot system versus fibrous. Your flower parts are in 4s and 5s. So if you see a plant that's flowering, you can count the petals. If you see 5 petals on it, more than likely it's going to be a dicot. Like on a vinca flower is very easy to see, or a hibiscus flower has those very distinctive rings of petals so that you could count those. And then again, there's sometimes a common name for dicots. We typically call them broadleaf plants versus the grasses for the monocots. And examples of those would be things like we've talked a lot of these: beans, oaks, hibiscus, sunflower. There's just a ton of dicots out there. So trying to give you an example of monocots in a list versus dicots, and some of those characteristics so that you can kind of see the difference between them. Okay, I know that's a lot of information. That would probably be one class lecture at a college level, which is essentially what I'm looking at. But I gave it to you in about 5 minutes. So if it's a little bit much, it's okay. Take a deep breath. You get to go back over your notes, go back through your book. I just wanted you to see that comparison, okay? No one gets scared yet. Okay, so let's look at, I'm going to show you a few of these things we just talked about one more time over here. The seed for a monocot has different seed parts within as well. You have a seed coat on it. We talk about this leaf sheath in here. That's the small leaves. When it comes out of the ground, we talked about it having a monocot. This is what we're talking about. This first leaf that comes out, that's that first leaf. Or the first true leaf is the green one, but when it comes out, it's got this kind of a sheath that protects it coming out. That's what's around this little plantlet here. In the seed, you have an embryo inside this, and it has this little leaf sheath that will expand once it gets the right conditions, the right water, the right temperature, things like that. So when it comes out, that's what we mean by monocotyledonous. When we talk about sheath venation, look at how the leaf wraps around the stem. You see how it's wrapping around the stem? And parallel veins, you see how the veins are going up and down that leaf? Corn plant being the very unique one, are the, not the unique, it's the most commonly known plant, because it's very easy to picture a corn plant. And when we talked about fibrous roots, the base of this plant here looks a little bit larger, but the roots essentially are about the same size, about the same size. And that's what we mean by a fibrous root system. When we look at a dicot, being the bean plant, again, you have the little embryo inside, and when it germinates and comes up, these seed leaves, which is this large endosperm inside, that's the cotyledon. So when it comes up out of the ground, that's protecting the true leaves till it gets up, and then they separate out. But there's two of them, so those are the two cotyledons there. When you look at the leaf attachment, you see how that kind of has that, they show that kind of circular connection of the leaf directly to it. It doesn't wrap all the way around the stem. That's what we mean by direct leaf attachment. And as your leaves grow, the true leaves start growing. These cotyledons, which were just a food source, they wither because they're sucking all the nutrients out of that. So that's what we mean by the cotyledons shriveling. And in our root system, you have some larger roots coming down, and it continues to be a large root, and then smaller roots coming off that and smaller roots off of that. So that what we call tap root system, you have larger roots going to smaller roots, and it's going to be a consistent pattern as that plant grows. That's what we mean by a tap root system. So that's some visualizations of monocot versus dicot. Okay. Any major questions before we move on? Okay, sounds pretty quiet, so we're going to move on. I know it's a lot to take in, drink some coffee, do something to help keep you relaxed and calm through all of this as we move on. Another form of classifications we sometimes talk about, particularly in horticulture. In horticulture, again, I said, we're the practical people. We're saying this is how plants grow. We talk about different life cycles, and we have 3 different groupings that we try to throw plants into. And these are not related to whether it's a monocot or a dicot. Sometimes we just talk about life cycles, and we talk about annuals. The definition of an annual is a plant that can complete its life cycle in 1 year or less. Some plants only live once it germinates for, a few weeks. Others will live for, a full 12 months or 9 months or 10 months. But you start with the seed, it grows, it flowers, it makes new seeds, and the plant dies. That's what we typically mean by an annual. And so examples of that are a lot of those things that we go to the nursery and buy those flowers, those purslane, the petunias, the coleus, basil, things like that will all complete its life cycle in less than a year. And then if depending on where you live, it's going to die when it gets cold. A biennial actually has two distinct growing seasons. We sometimes we'll call it 2 different years, but you're going to have 2 distinct growing periods. You're going to have our 2 growing seasons. The first year or the first season is all about vegetative growth. That means that that plant is trying to make roots, it's making stems, it's making leaves, it's trying to get some size to it. So it has a lot of resources available when it is time to go to flowering. But don't expect flowers initially. It's going to have to grow the main part of the plant first. And then it goes into a second year or a second growing cycle where it's not making a lot of new root stems and leaves. That's not its goal. Its goal is to make flowers so it can make seeds and complete the life cycle. And so that is all about reproductive growth, that second season, second year. Some things don't take 2 full years. Vernalization, which is a change in temperature, it can be a cooling down period for a while, and then getting warm can cause some plants to think that it's gone through a complete more than a year time frame. And so that can trigger going from vegetative growth into reproductive growth. And some examples of what are usually classified in biennials are asparagus. Again, the first year is all about getting roots and stems. And the asparagus, like we like to eat, at least this is the main edible asparagus, those flower stalks that come up the second year, that's what we're chopping off to eat, but it's not going to happen initially. Onions and shallots are all in that time frame. That's why we buy little onion starts, because it's already gone through the first part of establishing part of that vegetative growth, and it's going to speed up the process of development. Cabbage, we cut it off before it goes to flower, but if you left that cabbage head on there and it goes through a period, then it's going to eventually throw a flower stalk out later. So it has a very distinctive vegetative growth, thank goodness, because that's what we want to eat, are the leaves, the vegetative part, and then later on it would go into flowering mode. Parsley, hollyhocks, some things like that. So those are examples. And so if you're going to plant hollyhocks in the spring, don't expect them to bloom, because again, it's going to take some time. Perennials, so besides annuals for 1 year, biennials for 2 years, then we go into this term we call perennial. Those are plants that live for years, for many years, and they will bloom typically many different times. So a lot of our shrubs and our trees, and even a lot of our herbaceous plants, those soft bodied plants, they'll last for multiple years and they'll bloom. So that's where we throw most of our trees, our shrubs down here that we use in our landscape, because we want something that's going to last for a long time. So those are what we call perennials. So we have annual for 1 year or less, a biennial 2 years, quote, 2 years or 2 distinct growing seasons, and perennials, they live longer. That sounds great, but it's not always that cut and dried. We have this thing, particularly here in South Texas, because we have very mild winters, that some things that are considered annuals will live more than 1 year. But in most places, they're just considered annuals. And we call that term perennializing. That's kind of a term that we've developed in horticulture, that a plant can perennialize. Typically, it's known as an annual in most places because of the weather conditions. But they can last more than 1 year, especially where you have those mild winters and they don't freeze. If it got colder, a lot of those plants are going to die. And probably the prime example I always use are periwinkles or vinca. Same thing, same plant, 2 different common names there, but that plant will live for multiple years, and it'll get a nice big stem on it down here because our winters are so mild. I have some at my mom's house that she's had for 8 or 9 years there, I know. I didn't look to see if they came back after the freeze, but after a hard freeze this year, they're likely to have lost most of those. But we have that mild winter, so you may have plants that live multiple years that normally don't in other areas. And then there's some very tender perennials, some plants that grow well and they're used as annuals in other places. I'll tell you, I went up to Chicago once when I first started extension, and they were using hibiscus, and they said, oh, this is an annual. I said, no, it's not, but it's being used that way because up there it's going to die and they're going to replace it with something else, and they don't care. So they're using it like an annual, you know, firebush, esperanza, those tender, those tropical type plants that are perennials if you go much further north. I mean, they're annuals if you go much further north because they're going to freeze. It's just too cold for them. But we use them as perennials down here. So again, realize it's not always that simple. It's how we're using that plant. Anyway, that's the horticulture side, not the botanist side. Again, botanists would say, no, that's wrong. That is not an annual. That it can't be, you know, but it's how we use them. So again, horticulture versus botanists. And we're going to side with the horticulturists here as gardeners. Another form of classification that we need to look at are the types of weeds. Because again, this is what we talk about all the time. We talk about grass weeds, which again, that's what we throw the monocots as. We have broadleaf weeds, which are dicots. And then we have sedges. Now, sedges are a form of grass. They are related to the grasses, but they're in a slightly different family. They're in the family Cyperaceae. They have a very waxy coating. They are difficult to kill sometimes. And so we use different chemicals, different herbicides to control some of these. Because let's say you have a hedge and you keep getting Bermuda grass growing into a hedge. Bermuda grass is hard to get rid of, but we have some chemicals that work on monocots that don't affect dicots. So we can spray a grass herbicide that will affect the grass, but it's okay to spray around the monocots. I mean, the dicots. So that's an advantage of how chemicals, and it's how the different types of plants absorb, how they absorb. With that, you're going to see grasses versus broadleafs versus sedges. And then we have what we call that broad spectrum, means it kills everything. But this is all based on whether it's a monocot or a dicot. And then again, that sedge is a subcategory. It's all about that chemical mode of action. So with weeds, and we classify our weeds, that's what we usually are throwing them in as those categories. Within broadleaf, you may hear someone talk about an herbaceous, which means a soft stem versus a woody stem weed, but that's probably going to be affecting your broadleaves. Okay, zone classifications. We're using the USDA plant hardiness zone map. That is when we're talking about zones. That is what is primarily is used. And this is a map that was developed to talk about how much cold weather a plant can withstand. It is a plant hardiness zone. So it's based on the average low temperature in an area. And we have 10 zones that it's divided in here in the United States. So that average low temperature is in these 10-degree intervals that we call a zone. So the lowest temperature in this area is typically, let's say, between 20 and 30, or it's between 30 and 40, or it's between 10 and 20. That's what we mean by that zone classification. You'll see that. Because we know that some plants will grow better, and the way the zones line up in the country, you're going to see these lines that develop. And we know that some plants don't like really hot weather in the summer like we get in South Texas. And so we've kind of taken that general image and we've used it, and we say, oh, this plant can grow in zone 3 to 5 or 3 to 6. And it's what it's saying is that it's very cold hardy. It can go up to zone 3, and it's implying that it doesn't like really hot summers. But really, that you shouldn't say a plant is zone 3 to 6. What you need to say, it is a zone 3 plant. Because really, it's only about what's the cold temperature that plant can withstand. So again, sometimes we use it or misuse that image that you will see, which I'm going to show you, because it's really about what's the coldest weather. That is what USDA plant zone map is about. What's that cold temperature? And so when we talk about that, you'll see here it's divided up, and I'll show you a couple different pictures of Texas, but you'll see we start down here. This is the 9s in the tan. This is what we call 9B towards the valley. That is temperatures of 25 to 30 degrees. And 9A, our average temperature, the average low temperature tends to be somewhere between 20 and 25, which is occasional. We don't always get 20 to 25 degrees. And every now and then we'll get to 17 degrees like this winter. But when you average it out, that slight dip for a day disappears on averages. And then this would be zone 8 in the green, zone 7 in the red and pink here. That's 7B in the darker, 7A in the lighter. This would be 6 in the yellows, dark yellow being 6B, 6A. And then you get into the next, the two greens would be 5. There's 4. Here's 3, and then we get up into 2. So I mean, it's you can see how it looks, and there's a lot of things that affect those average temperatures here. Some of it is where we fall, how close we are to the equator. So that's longitude, as I remember, going up and down, if I have that right in my mind. So where we fall in longitude, but also it's how close are we to the coast? You know, the Gulf of Mexico water will regulate temperatures. So you see this 9, if it was strictly on longitude, let me back up a little bit. If it's strictly on the longitude here, then you would think, you know, here we are with Florida. But look at all of this coast of Texas up here. In Louisiana, there's parts of that that are considered 9A also, because the water is regulating the temperatures of that land. So there's a little strip right on the edge that stays warmer than when it gets further north. And then you get in some of these areas up here. What's happening in here? Why is some of this colder right in through here? What's in these areas of Colorado and northern New Mexico? What would make that colder?
Mount elevation.
Elevation, mountains. So again, you see that even within the state of Texas, as you're going from here up to here, this is moving from the coastline up into the Great Plains up, and that's raising elevations. So it's not just strictly this way, but you see a little bit more as you go, as the elevation gets higher there too. So there's multiple things that can affect that average freezing temperature. So moving into Texas a little closer, you can actually see all the 254 counties in Texas divided out here. And you can see this is 9B and 9A, and this would be 8B. So some of the coastal bend is in 8B. As you see, you know, we're right here in Nueces, but you get up into like B County right there, I believe is B County, and you get just a little beyond there, it starts getting a little colder, more inland. And then you get up towards San Antonio. You know, we know the summers are similar to San Antonio, but the winters really aren't. And then you have these little pockets here. Those are elevated areas, you know, that you're going to find. So again, that's 9. There's 8B, 8A, 7B, 7A, 6B, 6A up here in the north corner of Texas. Okay, so it's a little colder there than even down in where's my, down in this section. About 5 degrees difference. 5 degrees can make a difference because this saying that this commonly gets 0 to 5, and this is typically 5 to 10. When you look at the, or let's see, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, this is 0 to negative, I'm sorry, this is 0 to -5, and this is -5 to -10, even colder. I was gonna say that can't be right. So you can see as you get further up, it's colder temperatures, the average cold temperature, okay? Here's a little simpler form of the map that was put together for Aggie horticulture a few years ago. And this will be revised every 20 years or so. It doesn't change much, but every now and then it does. And with climate change, you're probably going to see a little shifting of cold temperatures. So anyway, you can see better where we are, where we fall. Okay, moving on. Another thing we talk about are chilling hours, and this is particularly with temperate plants, temperate fruit, and temperate flowering plants need a certain amount of cold weather. This is a survival mechanism. So we talk about some plants, some fruit trees in particular, like peaches and things like that. They need so much cold weather in order to flower consistently. And that's when we come into this chilling hour zone. And this is a complex system that they try to figure out how much cold weather has accumulated that plant has observed. And once it gets to a certain level, it thinks that winter is over and it will go back and flower later on. That's what this is all about. And it's survival. Back to plants that are naturally from North Texas, it's used to having a lot more cold weather. So it needs, if it starts warming up as a freak time in the middle of January and it starts flowering too early, it's going to die. And that's what we really saw this year. How many people had peach trees that started blooming in early February, and then guess what? Super freeze came in, killed all the flowers, and I've had a lot of people say, you know, my peach tree is alive, but I got no peaches. It's like, because it started flowering, or those flower buds even were already starting to expand, even if they weren't completely open. So they froze, those tips froze, those flower buds froze, or the tiny fruit, because that's the survival mechanism. It got tricked this year, and that happens every now and then. But we see that on those temperate fruit trees in particular. You see it on peaches, on plums, on apples, on pears. And with that, that's what when we're talking about chilling hours, that's what it is about. So I'll tell you a little bit about this. I did a lot of, that's what some doctorate work I was working on in the University of Florida was. And then we did it on azaleas, because azaleas are one of those flowering plants that need a certain amount of cold weather for those flowers to open. And that's why you see spring flowering plants that need that. Another spring flowering, what's a spring flowering shrub around here that only blooms in the spring? Anyone have any examples of other spring flowering shrubs? Since we don't grow very many azaleas unless you're really dedicated and you have a lot of either pine trees or oak trees and you do a lot of work. Think about anything that blooms.
Indian hawthorn.
Indian hawthorn is the classic one. You know, that needs a certain amount of cold weather in order for those flower buds to release and start opening. And different varieties of Indian hawthorn, some of the different pinks and the whites, you know, you'll see some of them, some varieties open a little earlier and some open a little bit later. And that's based on their chilling zone. It's the same thing with different types of azaleas. And you'll see us looking at the Formosa azaleas don't need as much cold weather. So we can actually grow a few of those down here where it doesn't get terribly cold. When you look at this, you see we're here right around 400 chilling hours, and it closer we are to the coast, the less that is, so this is a 400-hour chilling zone line. We're closer to probably 300. And then as you move up and higher elevations, those chilling lines move up. So you have about 600 chill units, 800 chill units on that line, 1,000 on this one. And with this, that helps us to understand what those plants need. We think, well, this is only a couple 100 miles, but how many of y'all love those Fredericksburg peaches? And you go up there and go, oh, I love this peach. And what kind of peaches? And the grower will tell you, oh, it's this variety of peach. And so what do? We run out, we buy that variety of peach, which needs right here in Fredericksburg about 800 chilling units. We bring it down here to Corpus Christi in South Texas. It only has about 400 chilling units. So guess what? It doesn't flower consistently. You may get a couple of flowers here and there, but it's not going to bloom like a peach tree in Fredericksburg. We have people that come in from up north, and one of the flowers they love all the time, people go, oh, I want to grow peonies. And it's like, well, that's not going to happen because peonies need that cold weather to bloom. And so you may get a lot of plant growth, but you're not going to get the flowering that you're expecting. So again, they need cold weather because it's a temperate plant, and we're not a temperate environment. We are a semi-tropical environment. So again, things to look at. Chilling accumulation also. This is and see if let me check my next slide. Okay. Chilling accumulation varies too. It's not just, it's the temperature between basically 32 and 50 degrees is when you can accumulate chill units. If it's below 32, that plant's not accumulating or losing chill units. But between 32 and 35 is the most efficient chill unit accumulation. And you basically, for every hour during that time frame, you get an hour of chill units. You get a little bit higher temperature in the upper 30s and low 40s, then you're probably like 70, 60% accumulation, that it takes more temperature in the 40-degree range than it does at 33 in order to accumulate those chill hours. And then as you get up towards 50 degrees, then you're down less than 50% accumulation. You get above 50 degrees, guess what? Because we get those warm winter days, you start losing hours. So it's kind of like pouring water into and I'll talk about this at the end. This all comes back at the end. It starts losing those chill units as it's been there in warmer temperatures, because it's trying to protect that plant from those warm, freaky cold winter or warm winter days. It needs more cold weather in order to know that winter is over. Okay, so that's chill units, and you'll see that sometimes. So we've gone through those plant names through binomial nomenclature. We talked some about whether a plant is a monocot versus a dicot. We talked about the different types of weeds being grasses and broadleafs and sedges. We talked about the plant zones of the USDA plant zone list, which from us is a zone 9A in this area. That's the cold tolerance of that plant. And then we also went and talked a little bit about this chilling hour zone of the US. And that's for temperate flowers, temperate fruit trees, so they know when winter's over. Those are some different classifications you may see as you're going through all the trainings of Master Gardeners and beyond Master Gardeners. So that's a lot of information, and we've gone for about a little over an hour. And do you have any questions in general about these classifications?
I've got a question, Michael.
Yes, Fred.
When you buy a pack of seeds, does it have the number of chilling hours on there?
If most seeds you buy, if they need chilling to germinate, have been pre-chilled. Same thing with bulbs. When you buy bulbs, a lot of bulbs need, that's vernalization. And we'll talk about that. That's another one to, the next time, at the end of my next time with y'all, we'll talk about that. But when you buy bulbs, they're pre-chilled, like lilies, if you buy Asiatic lilies and stuff like that, or daffodils, they're pre-chilled before they're shipped to you because they want to make sure that they bloom and you get a good response. Now down here, it's hard for them to, that's why some of those things don't re-bloom. Or if a seed needs, it comes from up north and it needs cold weather, it may not germinate down here. So that was a good question. Does that answer? I don't know. I don't think it's on the pack. I don't think it says on the pack. But if you're buying a fruit tree and you look at the tag, it should tell you what the chilling units is. It should tell you the chill units. If it doesn't, get out your phone and take the variety and look it up and say, you know, Florida Prince Peach chill units, and it'll tell you, is it a 200 chill unit plant or is it a 425 chill unit plant, depending on what part of Florida. Is it from here in southern Florida? Is it from central Florida? Is it from the panhandle? 3 different things, all part of that Florida thing. So do the research, particularly on the fruit trees, those temperate fruit trees, to see what that chill unit is. And you want something around 3 to no more than 400 chill units around here. If you get too low, you're going to have these winters that you're going to lose. So if you get this southern Florida variety, you may lose fruit sometimes on that. Okay.
Yeah, so when you buy a plant that's already chilled and you bring it and it's gonna last several years, will it bloom the second year if it doesn't have the chill hours?
Nope. You may get a flower or 2. Let's say those peach trees from Fredericksburg, you'll have a few of those flowers that eventually develop, but you're not going to have that big burst of flowering that you normally get. So you'll have a few stragglers. Okay. Let's go on to some plant parts. I'm going to look at the vegetative plant parts and then probably stop once we get through the 3 vegetative plant parts as a good stopping spot. And then the next class will start with the reproductive plant parts and then go on into plant processes. So moving on, the plant organs. This is from the previous Master Gardener book, and I just have not updated it. But it gives you, there's 2 general plants of the plant. What we call plant parts are really organs of that plant. We don't always think of them as organs, but there's 2 general categories of plant parts. That stuff, and we talked about this a minute ago when we talked about biennial plants. What are the 2 types of growth we typically see on plants? Anyone want to guess? First year on a biennial is what kind of growth? Do y'all remember?
Vegetative.
Vegetative. That's the vegetative growth. And the other one, the second year, is the reproductive. So our plant, within this, we have plant parts that are vegetative plant parts, and we have reproductive plant parts. So in our vegetative plant parts, we have roots, stems, and leaves. That's the vegetative growth. In reproductive, we have flowers, fruits, and seeds. And so we are going to focus on that. This first part, I'm going to talk today about roots, stems, and leaves. And the next time we'll talk about flowers, fruits, and seeds, and then different plant processes. So that's where we are. Again, pictures from just some terminology that's out there. And unfortunately, this fun little Zoom stuff goes and covers the tip. But at the top, you'll see a terminal bud. That's the terminal is the tip. So you may hear that term. And I'm just showing this to let you know a few terms that are out there. The flower, of course, we know what that is. When we talk about a leaf axil, where this leaf is attached to the plant, there's an angle between the stem and where that leaf is. That's what we call the leaf axil. And so when we talk about an axillary bud, that is a bud that's in the leaf axil. That's right there. Another term for that is a lateral bud. That's some places will call that. Let's look at this plant right here. You see the way this leaf is attached? You look at this leaf. Is this a monocot or a dicot? Anyone want to take a guess?
Dicot.
It's a dicot. Why do you think it's a dicot? I can see two distinct.
So it doesn't wrap around and it has the direct attachment.
Okay, it has direct attachment. That's the first thing. But when you look over here, there's something else that tells you that it's probably a dicot.
Knitted veination.
Netted veins. Hold on one second. Deidre, I'm teaching a class till noon, and then I'll be done. That's okay. I'll call you as soon as it's done. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Root types. When we look at roots, we're going to look at root stems and leaves. So that at root types, we talked about two different ones. We talked about fibrous roots, which are the grasses. Our monocots fall in that, but that's also our palms and those sedges. Remember, we talked about sedges. They also have fibrous roots. A lot of those basically about the same size. And I'm getting an echo right now. Okay, there we go. It's better. Tap roots. When we talk about a tap root, was that monocots or dicots? Do y'all remember? Dicots. Okay. I saw someone mouth it and I heard it as well. So, but within taproots, there's different types of taproots as well. And so I'm going to introduce you to a few of those terms again, just so you're familiar with them. We have what we call a fattened taproot. Means that the main root, the main taproot is fatter. And those are our root crops. That's our carrots, that's turnips, that's radishes. It's got a big fat root with a lot of carbohydrates stored in it. Then we have what we call a primary taproot. These are plants that have one really main deep root that goes down, and then you have a branching off of that. So you hear some plants need that long taproot to be successful. Another one, even though they do spread also, but they do have a tendency to have more of a primary taproot, are pecan trees. You look at a pecan tree when you buy it, they're often in really tall pots, the most successful ones, because they have more of a primary taproot system than other types of trees. Most trees don't go down as deep as a pecan tree main root does. You'll also have what we sometimes call equal taproots. And that's why you have multiple large roots coming from the main trunk, but they're about the same size. And then they spread out and they divide and they divide and they divide. And that's oaks and hibiscus and sunflowers. So some pictures of this I got out of a different book, but that carrot, we know what a carrot root looks like. And it does have smaller roots that come off of that fattened taproot, but it is fat. And that's the way to look at it. Then you have what we call a primary taproot, where you have a really deep root that's the plant is known for. And that's what we call a primary taproot. But there are also these secondary roots that go off from there too. But if there's one root that a plant tends to go down, we talk about it having a primary taproot. And this is a liatris essentially out in West Texas, and it's sometimes called blazing star, but it has a very deep root. And in West Texas, it makes sense because there's more moisture down deep, even during a drought condition. So this is a perennial out in West Texas. A sunflower, it has multiple, see some pretty fat roots, and then other roots separate off of it. That's what we call equal tap roots. You look at your oak trees, when they come out, they have these roots that kind of spread out. An oak tree doesn't have one deep fat root in it. You dig them up, you pull them out of the ground, they kind of are all spread out, which is, one of those things that many of us were taught wrong, 50, 60 years ago. So those equal roots that spread out, you get larger roots than to smaller and smaller and smaller roots. Okay. And then the fibrous roots, they're all about the same size. Some are long, some are shorter, but they're about the same size. That's what we mean by fibrous roots. So this gives you a little bit of visualization of a swollen root versus a taproot, a primary taproot, and then equal taproots versus fibrous roots. Does that help y'all a little bit to see a picture of what we mean with those terms? I'll take that as a yes and move on. So roots, roots have a function for plants. Plants need roots. What are some things that plants use roots for? Someone give me one.
Get water.
To get water, they use for water. Someone give me another one.
Food.
Food or nutrients. What else do roots do for plants?
Support.
Support or stability, yes. What is something else one more thing that they do for plants?
Keep them stable to the ground. Sorry.
I'm sorry, Linda. What was
Provide
that again?
oxygen.
They have to have oxygen. Those roots need oxygen to live too. And for some plants, the roots can have adaptations that allow air movement, but that wasn't the primary one I was thinking of. Think about that carrot. That's your hint.
Store carbohydrates.
Storing carbohydrates. So it's a storage unit for sugars. So as those, again, support and anchorage, that's one we don't think about a lot, but that's why plants need roots. Because if not, when it rains, when any of those heavy rains, those plants are somewhere else. They're going to move on because they don't physically move around, but those roots keep them in place and it gives them the support. So when the wind blows, they're standing up. So again, a poorly rooted plant is more likely to suffer damage from wind and erosion and things like that. So a good, strong root system is important for them. And then again, they absorb water, they absorb nutrients. And I didn't say that they take in food, they absorb nutrients. And this is really important because plants make their own food through photosynthesis. The nutrients are the building blocks that are needed for some of that. So they absorb water, they absorb nutrients. That's another reason when we're watering plants, if you're watering the leaves, lots of times someone say, water at the base of the plant. Why? Because if it gets in the soil, the roots can take up the water. Most plants cannot take up sufficient water from their leaves to support the plant. Now it can help to cool them down, and there's a few plants that have adaptations that can absorb water in other ways, but most plants are absorbing water from the roots. And when nutrients are then dissolved in the water and they move up with the water. They also are there for food storage or carbohydrate storage, like that carrot or a turnip or something like that. And so with that, that's how plants use. Those are the main things that they use the roots for. Showing you a picture, and roots grow in a unique way. Well, and plants actually grow in a unique way, unlike animals. Animals, we kind of grow from a small thing and we kind of expand out and we're growing in all directions. Plant parts typically are growing unidirectional, and roots are a prime example. If you look at the root zones, we have this root cap, which is at the bottom. That root cap is the very point, and these have some cells on them. I always call these sacrificial cells. These are the cells that as that root is being pushed through the soil, they're going to get damaged. That's the hard hat cells on the tip of that root. So as that root is growing and expanding and pushing down into the soil, because that's how roots grow, is they push through stuff as they're expanding. you're going to have some cells that are damaged at the point. So that's the root cap that you sometimes see. And then we have a area right behind it, which is called the meristematic zone. A meristem means a growth zone, where new cells are being formed. A meristem is where new cells are formed, an area of cell division or mitosis. So you have these little tiny cells that their whole job in that section is just to divide and make more, and divide and make more, and divide and make more. And as they do, the new cells are being formed and pushed further down into the soil. So you're actually seeing that, and that's why a root grows down, is because new cells are being formed at the tip and pushing down. Behind there, those cells that were formed not too long ago, they start elongating, they start filling up with water, and as they get larger, they expand, and that expansion of those cells is pushing the area of mitosis and the root cap. As these get bigger, it's like taking a balloon and filling it up. It pushes whatever's at the tip down. So it's pushing these down, pushing this area down into the soil. And that's why you need that root cap to protect the area where the cells are dividing. So these are undifferentiated cells at the root tip. So these are expanding, that elongation zone. They're just getting long. And then once they get long, you know, it's kind of like teenagers kind of initially growing, and they just eat and eat and eat and get bigger. But then, you know, there's an area behind here we call the maturation zone. And this is where all those cells, those kind of uniform cells, start getting jobs. And some of them that are in the interior are cortex, and they're used for storage. And then some of them become the xylem and the phloem, which are the vascular system that moves water and nutrients up and carbohydrates down. Some of them may be epidermal cells on the outside edge. Some of them maybe form root hairs on them, so on the epidermis, so that they can absorb more water. So they're getting specialization there as they move further up this, as they are older. So again, this root, this is where new cells are made. And then as after they divide and you get two little tiny cells, they start getting filled with water, and it pushes that root cap down, and it pushes it down into the soil. Does that make sense? So that's when roots are growing down. It's just because they're making more roots and are more cells at the tip. And those cells, as that root is pushed into the soil, is because cells are elongating. Is that kind of clear as mud for y'all? Okay, Tom says it's okay for him. I don't know if not hearing anyone else.
That's good.
Okay, so, and we're going to talk about this with stems, because stems grow kind of the same way in a minute. So you're going to understand a little bit there. Another thing about roots, did you have a question, Linda? Okay, so when we talk about roots, not only do plants use certain ways, you know, we use roots as well. So I like to separate out, why do people need roots of plants? Because I think that we don't think about that enough. But you know, we use them for food. There are roots that we eat. They are crop foods, particularly things like, again, we talked about carrots and radishes and turnips and those root crops. Erosion control. You know, here when they get finished with all of the crops and they till them under, and we start getting wind, that dust and stuff starts flying over. That's one of the reasons that people put grass in lawns when they first create a new home, because they need something to prevent erosion, both from wind and from water. So roots are really important for erosion control, and that's why grasses are so commonly used for that. They also improve the soil, believe it or not. We don't always think about that. We talk about improving the soil before we plant a plant, but as roots are moving through that soil and growing, as some of them die and die off, they create air spaces in between as well. So roots, as they're moving through, they're breaking up the minerals and allowing water to move in around the edge of those roots. And as they die off, they leave little pockets so that water can be stored easier and move through that. So roots can improve the soil that we can use for other things. And thus that improves soil aeration too. And you have a soil that has roots in it, you're gonna have more air movement up and down the soil. So that's all about roots. This first of the three vegetative plant parts. Then I'm gonna move quickly into stems next. Any questions on roots? Again, this is an overview. This was a week's worth of lessons in 5 minutes, in a college class. So go back, read your book, think about it, but look at that big picture. Plants use roots for certain things, people use roots for certain things, and then look at how those roots grow in the cells in the roots.
Michael, I've got a question on the
Sure.
books.
On mulch.
When are we
okay?
getting the books?
I don't know. I just teach class. You should be getting your books shortly. I don't know. Talk to Vince on that one.
All right.
He'll tell you at the end of the class, I'm sure. Okay, let's go back to stems. These stems have functions for the plants. What are the things that plants use stems for? Someone give me one example. Support, okay. You got to have support and stability. Now, it's not what holds them in the ground, but it's what holds them up. So you have to have that strength. Otherwise, if you think about it, they provide a framework. Otherwise, you just have all these leaves that are kind of lumped at the ground. And the stems, by providing a framework and support, it gets those leaves up and spread out so that the air can move around them, and it moves them out so they can get better light penetration and become more efficient for photosynthesis. So it gives a framework. So support and structure for leaves and buds. Otherwise, we just have this pile of leaves on the ground. Another thing is they conduct food, water, and nutrients. That's the other big thing. That's where the majority of your vascular system, you think about it, are in stems. Stems are made up of vascular systems, moving the water and nutrients. It's down at the roots. We said that's what roots do, is they absorb it. Well, it's got to get up to the leaves. And so how does it do that? It goes through the stem. And the same thing with the food that's being made. The carbohydrates that are being made are taken from the top where the leaves are and being moved into the roots and other stems. So it is conducting food, moving that in certain directions of the vascular system, and then moving water and nutrients up as well. So again, conducting food, water, and nutrients. And another thing, some stems are carbohydrate storage units. And so some stems aren't. I mean, you look at we eat celery, but celery is considered a very lean food, because what is celery, if you look at it, it is nothing but those little tubes, which is the vascular system. It's not storing lots of carbohydrates in it, where other stems do. There are certain stems that are much fatter and have more carbohydrate storage in the actual stem. Can you think of a stem that stores food?
Sugarcane.
Sugarcane's an excellent example because it has the carbohydrates are being stored within the stem. It also has a lot of that vascular system in it too. There's another one that's kind of a trick answer. It's a specialty stem. Wait a minute, I'll show it to you when we talk about types of stems in a second, then you'll see it. Another thing that stems are used by plants is propagation. As a stem lays over on the ground, it can root and make another plant with roots, or we can take those plants and cut them off, and when they fall or plant them, then we can create plants, but for some plants, those plants that kind of have weak stems, that's a way that they can multiply. Or you have a stolon on grass that grows above ground. Those stems that go out, as it's spreading out, they're rooting in other spots. So if it gets chopped off, it allows for propagation. So again, another function of stem for the plant there. And if it's a green stem, like the green stem on grass, or you're looking at the celery, things like that, green stems can conduct photosynthesis, but usually not as efficiently as the leaves, because they don't allow the water or the air penetration as easily as the way the leaves are designed. So photosynthesis in some cases. We use stems. Man uses stems for what? What are some things that we use plant stems for?
Straws, like you can do it when you're diving in the water for oxygen. You can
Okay,
actually-
we can use it kind of like to breathe, and it's kind of that same concept.
Yeah.
Okay, what's another thing that a type of plant stem that's being used by man? What's another function
Lumber.
that? Say that again.
Bamboo to build homes.
Lumber, yes. I mean, you think about it, tree trunks are, that's a plant stem. That's where we get our lumber from. Aren't we glad that we have large plants, that we have lumber? I mean, look around, I mean, we wouldn't be in the kind of situations we are without it. So lumber is definitely another one. Anything else that stems?
A hickory switch for discipline.
Discipline. I love that. Thank you, Fred, for that one. Anything else you can think of? Anyone eat a stem lately?
Cooking.
Cooking, food, yes. So stems are sometimes there for us for food source. So some of the ones that I had, food crops, celery, potatoes, and onions are 3 examples. Potato is a stem. How many people knew potatoes were stems?
Yeah.
No.
It's a tuber. A tuber is a modified stem. It's an underground stem. And you look at a potato, if you've left it in your pantry for a little bit longer, and what starts growing on it?
Sprouts.
The sprouts are the eyes. Where the new sprout comes off, that is an axillary bud. The axillary buds are on the stem, and it just happens to be underground. So a potato is kind of that, and an onion is kind of a tricky one, because the inside of the onion has a little compact stem in it, and then it has fleshy leaves all the way around it. So an onion technically has that stem, but without that base of that onion stem, you wouldn't have the fleshy leaves that make up the onion that we enjoy. So if you cut that onion in half and look in the center, there's that little tiny stem at the bottom. So it's again, a modified stem with lots of fleshy leaves around it. And so that's a bulb, a plant with fleshy leaves. We use them for lumber and wood, as we mentioned. Fiber is another thing that some plants have a lot of fiber in that stem, and they can strip it down and then use it for the vascular systems, for making fibers. And then we take them when they're done and we chop it up. We use it as mulch, because those stems last longer than leaves. Leaves wither, and the stems have more lignin in them, which is slower to break down. And so it gives us that added benefit over time of being used as mulch. So some of those modified stems we kind of talked about. Here's a few. I believe there's 4 different ones we're going to talk about. A rhizome, again, terms to look at, things to go out and look for as well. A rhizome. A rhizome is an underground horizontal stem. So 2 things it needs. It needs to be under the ground, and it needs to be horizontal. Easy examples to remember, you look at a ginger plant, it has those underground stems that grow to the side, and then you get shoots that come up. But it does have a distinct underground rhizome. Cannas do that same thing, they kind of throw that out. Bermuda grass actually also has underground stems. They have rhizomes. It's one of the reasons that Bermuda is so difficult to get rid of, is not only do you have those above ground stems that spread out, which we're about to talk about, but they also have the underground rhizomes. They have them both, which just drives me crazy. So and then a stolon it's very similar, but it's a horizontal stem, but those are above ground. And St. Augustine grass is the one that we typically think of the most, but there are other grasses that have it. And like I said, Bermuda grass has both stolons above the ground and under the ground. So that's why that Bermuda grass is so prolific at times and difficult to get out of your flower beds. Just pulling the top off isn't going to do it. And then we have a tuber, which we talked about. That is it's an underground stem, but it's fleshy. It's a fleshy underground stem. That's a tuber. So I wanted you to be familiar with that term, and that's what a potato is. And if you grow potatoes, you know, potatoes start off looking a lot like a tomato plant, and then we pile dirt on the base, and from there, that's where those stems grow down and make the tubers. They don't grow off the roots way down underneath, that you're piling dirt up on the base of that stem, and that's where the tubers form from. And then a bulb, another modified stem, they have fleshy leaves that surround a very small, tiny interior stem. And so the ones that y'all are probably the most familiar with is like an onion or an amaryllis. So again, a bulb is that fleshy leaf surrounding a small stem. And then there's another one that has, instead of fleshy leaves surrounding, you can have dried leaves surrounding a small stem, and a gladiolus is an example of those of a corm, which is very similar to a bulb. You know, it's kind of that splitting hairs thing, but the leaves tend to be drier on a corm versus a bulb. So some pictures and something else. I'll show you one other thing here. Rhizome is the horizontal underground stem. And from there, you're going to get shoots on that stem. You're going to have shoots that pop up. A stolon is the above ground horizontal stem, and there's going to be shoots that pop up from certain points on that stem. The bulb is under the ground, but it's very fleshy, has a short little stem. Excuse me. A short stem, but fleshy leaves that surround it. Fleshy leaves that surround the stem. And from here, remember, wherever a leaf is attached, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, but wherever a leaf is attached, there's a potential for a shoot. So inside, down near the stem, there are actually little tiny shoots that are ready to expand. On a corm we said has dried leaves, but on here, you're going to have these little shoots that kind of pop out on the sides of a corm, and that makes it a little bit different because the stem isn't surrounded by those fleshy leaves. It's kind of a dried stem and has dried leaves around it. So that's why you sometimes get these little shoots, those little lateral buds on the side of a corm coming up. That's a slight difference. So those types of stems. Another classification we call about stems, we talk about herbaceous stems versus what's the other one? If it's not herbaceous, we call it a what stem?
Woody.
A woody stem. Now herbaceous, again, this terminology just means that it's softer. It's a softer stem. It's usually green. It's sometimes fleshy. And you can have some plants that will start off with an herbaceous type stem, and over time that stem will harden off and become woody. So that same stem starts off lots of times herbaceous when it's young versus later on becoming woody. And when you're talking about propagation, that's where some people say, oh, get an herbaceous stem, get a soft stem, or use a woody stem to take this cutting, because some plants do better using one type of stem, some do better uses the other. So herbaceous is just that softer, usually green and fleshy stem, where the woody is harder. Again, you can see that the rings for that multiple year of growth. And if a plant has rings in the stem, is it a monocot or a dicot? Dicot, okay, thank you. So again, looking at a quick picture, these are a very basic line drawing, but it will help you understand stems. The monocots here, you have a stem, and you have vascular bundles. Each one of these little bundles in here has both xylem and phloem within it. And they, if you look at them under a microscope, we were always taught that they look like monkey faces because they have like a big round, they have some small ones up near the top that look like the eyes, but then there's a big open mouth, which is the xylem towards the inside. Phloem is always to the outside of the stem. Xylem's always to the inside. Even in a vascular bundle, they're still arranged so that xylem is towards the center of that stem and phloem's towards the outside. But if you're taking a plant and you're cutting a cross section of a stem, you can, on a woody plant, that's what this side is over here, it actually has these plant rings instead of the bundles. You'll see that distinct difference. And again, xylem is always to the center and phloem is always to the outside. And the very center of a woody stem, where everything's kind of dead, I don't want to say it's dead, it's non-functional in terms of water movement. The xylem and the phloem are your vascular tissues that they're actively moving water and nutrients up and carbohydrates down. But there's some sections in the middle of some stems that aren't vascular tissues, that they're really, they're and like in a carrot, you know, you think about where does the carbohydrate stored? It's stored in the pith. It's stored in these parenchyma cells. They're kind of undifferentiated cells. They're not vascular. And so that's that center section of some stems. And some xylem also can, over time, become unfunctional. And sometimes that's included in the pith. So the whole purpose of the stem is that vascular system. And I think of a vascular system that has two parts. I think of it like an interstate highway. You go to San Antonio, you have a northbound lane and you have a southbound lane. And in that northbound lane, we're taking things that, we're taking resources from, let's say, the Port of Corpus Christi up to factories in San Antonio. And so that's moving stuff, moving those basic resources up to where something can happen with them at factories in San Antonio. And then you have a southbound lane too. Guess what? We get stuff in, we get manufactured goods from San Antonio. I'm simplifying this, of course, but those things that they've been made in the factories, they come back because guess what? Corpus Christi needs some of those things too. Think about it as a plant. The transportation has two different parts. It has xylem and it has phloem. That's the northbound, southbound lanes. And those routes where we are absorbing water and nutrients they need to move that water nutrient somewhere. It goes through the transportation system of the xylem, of the vascular system, and goes up to the factories of the leaves, and then once it makes carbohydrates, that carbohydrate has to be moved down. So we have two main parts. We talked about this a second ago when that picture of the vascular bundles and of the rings, you have xylem and you have phloem. Xylem is always to the interior of the stem. That's the first thing I mentioned. The other thing is, what does xylem move?
Water.
Xylem, water and nutrients. It takes the water and nutrients from the roots and it moves it up to the leaves. So xylem moves up, moves those things up, and then phloem, if xylem's to the interior of the stem, phloem's to the
Outside.
outside or the exterior. And if xylem's moving water and nutrients up, what's the phloem doing?
Brings carbohydrates down.
It's moving primarily carbohydrates down. It can move other stuff, but its main job is to get stuff away from the leaves to make more room. So again, some things to remember to help you remember this. This is, again, I do this for my live class, but xylem, what does xylem do? Or first of all, where is it to where's it located? To the inside, and what direction does it go?
Up.
Up.
Northbound.
So xylem's up, phloem is down.
Down.
So again, what moves up? What's moving things up? I should say, what is moving things up in it?
Nutrients.
Xylem. What's moving things down? Phloem. Someone told me, actually, former master gardener here had a great way. She said phloem, xylem is up. And I think of X and U are close together in the alphabet, xylem up. And it's like, how do you remember phloem? And Stephanie Martin said, things flow them down. They flow down. They flow them down. So it's like, hey, it works, a way to remember something. So xylem up moves, what moves up? Water and nutrients, and phloem down, carbohydrates. Very good. Another term in the stem I want to make sure y'all are familiar with is the node versus the internode. And the node is a point where a leaf is attached. So this plant here, if you look at this plant, is that a monocot or a dicot?
Dicot.
Okay, I have a dicot. I have one answer for a dicot. Anyone want to?
Monica. I think it's Monica.
This looks to me like a monocot, and the reason why, if you look here, it looks like it wrapped around the stem right there. You see, it's hard to see. It's not a perfect drawing, but to me, it has this little node, like kind of segments, like bamboo. Think about bamboo. Bamboo has segments on it. Bamboo is a monocot. Just like grass, if you have a long runner of grass, it has these little segments on it, and you're seeing that. You look at a corn plant, or you look at a Dracaena, that tropical plant we sometimes call corn plant. So each one of those spots, again, where a leaf is attached is a node. And so I think this is a monocot. It's hard to say. I'm not, because it's a pretty simple drawing. But the main thing is where a leaf is attached is a node, and the space between two nodes is an internode. Those are the two terms you need to know. A node where a leaf is attached, and an internode is the space between them. And the other thing you can tell where a node is, and if it's a stem, is where that leaf, you can find those leaf scars, whether it goes all the way around the stem or whether it's the little round or U-shaped one for direct attachment. You can find where that leaf was attached and look right here at the base of where that leaf is. Even if the leaf is gone, you should see a little bud. Where a leaf is attached, there should be a bud. And if there's not, it's not a true leaf. It's probably a leaflet, which is a part of a subpart of a leaf. So that's a leaflet. So this is a node where a leaf is attached. At that node in the ax, remember this is the axil. You should have a little tiny bud or a little branch waiting to grow, and the space between is the inner node. So those are the basic terms. Now, if you want to impress someone, anyone have a plant that you've left in the shade and it starts stretching? You like a coleus is a great example. You start off with these cute little coleus, or tomatoes. We're getting ready to do fall gardens. You have a tomato plant, and you get these cute little tomatoes, and you put them in the shade because you don't want them to dry out from the sun, and they start stretching. That when the stem, you look at that stem stretching, the leaves, you're not getting new cells being made. What you're having is those cells are elongating, and it's the cells between those leaves that are elongating. The technical name of stem stretching is internodal elongation. Now, doesn't that sound impressive? I'm observing internodal elongation on these plants. And someone goes, oh, I thought the plant stems were stretching there. And they are. Sometimes it's adding water, and sometimes it's also can be due to hormones. Another part of the lecture. So I wanted you to see that. Some other terms here. The tip of the bud is the terminal, just like a terminal at an airport is that end point at the airport. Here we have an axillary bud, and it is there's a leaf there. Again, it's back that axis. You may see this where the leaf scar is. Is this a monocot or a dicot?
Dicot.
Dicot. Also, this bud could be a flower bud or it could be a stem bud at that leaf scar. It doesn't have to be a flower bud there. The space between the two nodes here is the inner node. We talked about that. And then there's two other things I want you to see. There are some stems more than others that have these little air openings for air to move in and out of the stem. Those are lenticels. That's the name of it. So if you hear a lenticel, that's just a little air pocket, air opening, air hole opening in the stem. And then also plants that tend to grow for multiple years. Sometimes you'll hear them talk about growth rings, and that's basically as you get towards the fall, plants stop growing and the stems aren't elongating. So you get this little spot where they go dormant and the cells are really tight and small, and it creates this little spot. And then when it starts growing in the spring, they get a lot of water and they start growing really rapidly and they elongate. But you have this little spot where you have these little short cells that never fully elongate. And so you'll see these little areas and you can tell where it grew for this year. That's a growth ring, just so that you're familiar with some of those terms. Again, these are all things that we've talked about. So stem buds. And again, when you think about cabbage, cabbage is basically a bud. That is a stem because you have that little base with all those leaves around it, or the onion, but that is, it's basically a form of an enlarged bud. Same thing with lettuce, and asparagus is another stem as you're looking at it, getting ready to produce flowers. So again, stems, we're not going to be able to do leaves today because it's already 12 o'clock. But with stems, the other thing I wanted to mention on growth, similar to the root, up here at the tip, this terminal bud, that's where your area of mitosis is. This is where new cells are being formed. And then they get, as they start to grow, then they elongate, and this bud keeps moving up, and these cells elongate then, and then they start getting jobs and they mature, just like in the root. Because if you look at a tree, the way a tree stem grows, it keeps growing taller, it grows up, it adds to the tip. And that's because your mitosis, those new cells are being formed at the tip. And that's why we talk about protecting that growing point so much in a stem. Now you can, if something happens and it dies, one of these other stems can start growing and it becomes the same thing. But again, it grows from that point on. You're not making new cells that grow out. There's just whatever cells you have, other than making new xylem and new phloem, because those will be formed to the outside as that tree trunk grows. But you're not, the stem, as it's making a new stem, it's really adding to the tip. And that's like if you ever have written your name on carved your name on a tree, that name doesn't grow taller as that tree grows older. The name stays in the same place. It's just adding point to the growing tip. So remember, those plants are growing to the tip. That's where the growth is happening, just like the roots are growing to the root tip. So that's kind of your take home of how plants are growing. Next time we'll get into leaves, and then we'll go into flowers. Those two will go pretty quickly, and then we'll go into some basics of plant processes when we meet the next time. Any questions so far on nomenclature, the different types of classification systems, and then on roots and stems? Because roots and stems are take the most time, but I'm trying to respect those of you who have plans after 12 o'clock. Anything else?